Okay, welcome everybody to the July 23rd Government Operations Committee meeting. I think some of us are having some technical difficulties, so apologies for being late. Is everybody here who needs to be here?
Is Tim here? Or was he not?
I'm here.
Okay.
I think Tim was having difficulties too. You're on the phone, right, Tim?
Yep, I'm here via phone.
Yeah, okay, me too. So I guess if everybody's here, Patrick, are you here?
Yes, sir.
All right, well, let's get started then. So I guess the first thing we need to do is to approve the minutes of our last meeting. So does anybody have any corrections, changes, anything that they want to do to the minutes?
I move that we adopt the minutes.
All right, thank you. So we have a move to adopt. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, any further discussion? If not, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Anybody opposed? All right, so the minutes are adopted. Okay, so we have two things on our agenda tonight, and if I can find my email, just one second. One is a discussion of our, minority business activities, and then the second is the naming policy. So, Josh, whilst I try to find the email, do you want to take over?
Yes, we'll do. All right, so I was sharing the agenda for everybody to see, and I'm going to pull up where we left off last meeting. And so I'm going to share a slide, which is kind of where we stopped last meeting real quick here. So just give me a sec to get this up on the screen. All right, so I wanted to thank all of our staff on this evening as well. So we've got our finance team, which includes their purchasing team within finance, and we also have staff for our second item tonight. So our goal tonight is to continue the conversation from last meeting, which was June 1st, and in that meeting, we provided this presentation with the goal of talking about what it looks like at Athens-Clarke County to think about a proactive race-neutral approach and a race-specific approach. So the way we ended in the minutes, our representative of this last meeting, the GOC recommended, so if you can see the screen here, bullet points 2, 3, and 4 of the second option, proactive race-neutral approach. And there was consensus around that. What's left to talk about is the race-specific approach. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're going to try to answer any questions y'all have about that tonight. So staff, Crystal and I, we collected a number of FAQs from other communities that have done disparity studies and some other information that we shared with you earlier in the week or late last week, with the hope, that would help answer some of the questions, but that we might be able to then begin to clarify the remaining questions. So where we're going from here is the GOC needs to develop a recommendation. So because we only talked about and agreed on one part of this, I wasn't really able to write a recommendation to then provide to Commissioner Herod. I wanted to make sure we fleshed out everything and that there was a discussion about each of these pieces. And then the other item that came up since, so y'all have adopted the budget since this as well. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about tonight, and maybe we start here, is actually the first bullet of part 2. So underneath proactive race neutral approach, the first bullet was an MBE position. And so where we ended last meeting was that y'all didn't want to do that at this point, but then it was added as part of the budget process later. So I thought maybe what we could do is, from the GOC's perspective, how do y'all see that position working based on the other things y'all have discussed. Maybe we could start there. That's all right.
Okay, thank you. So, who wants to kick off?
I have some ideas.
Okay.
I mean, I'd like to ask staff. Do you think it's important that we do a disparity study before coming up with what an MBE position looks like, or what goes first, chicken or egg? Should we hire an MBE specialist to help choose the disparity study? Like, I'm just wondering what should come first. I mean, I feel that it's clear that we need a disparity study. We can't begin to move forward unless we know how far behind we are.
Sure. And Commissioner Link, I think I can answer that question. Before we do anything that would treat any business differently based on race, or any other classified or any other protected class, I think we'd have to have the disparity study to justify that. But I think Toro's in the line and can speak to it too. I think the intent of the new MBE individual staff person was to help us go ahead and start collecting data and to continue our mission of reaching out and making sure that our opportunities are advertised to minorities and female-owned businesses and things like that. So I think there are plenty of things that a person could do in this position that wouldn't necessarily implicate the things that we would require for a disparity study. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes total sense. I just wanted to clarify that.
So, Chairman, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So, Attorney Hines, you're saying to do the study first to evaluate the businesses that are currently applying first? Or did I miss something?
Sure. So what I'm saying is if we want to develop a policy and have an MBE staff person whose job is to facilitate a program where we are giving preference to people or to businesses based on their minority status, we need to have the disparity study. But we certainly can use the MBE person for other things, particularly collecting data that will help us justify having a true MBE program. In the meantime, we can go and start that process without the disparity study.
Andy, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Thanks. This is definitely harder doing on the phone.
It really is.
So I guess because that's kind of the way I followed it also, the way that Sherry explained it there. And I guess the one issue I see is that right now, as part of our budget, we have the MBE position funded, but we don't have funding for the disparity study. And so, I mean, I don't know if there's enough wiggle room in the way that the budget was created. We drafted it to say that we would use that funding to go ahead and fund the disparity study, since for the MBE position to do everything we needed to do, the disparity study has to come first. So I wonder I don't know if that's a recommendation we can bring back to the commission to go ahead and use that funding we set aside to do the disparity study first or not.
May I have a moment, please?
Toro?
So
Commissioner Harris, I think Toro wanted to share real quick on the purchasing side.
okay.
As far as procurement is concerned, our primary goal is to provide equal opportunity for everyone, but to also recognize that everyone didn't start the race at the same time, and provide additional help to anyone that needs to get to the starting line where everyone else started from. So I do not think that there needs to be money spent on an inclusion study, but I do feel that a person dedicated to providing the citizens of Athens with an equal starting point would be advantageous.
So because you kind of broke up there a little bit as you were speaking, but if I understood you correctly, what you said is that the MBE position, which is now funded in the budget, this is a position that somebody could basically start doing some of the things that we used to do in the past, which was to proactively reach out to minority-owned businesses and to make sure that they're aware of the bidding process and this kind of stuff. As kind of a first step, that's something that we can do immediately, and then depending upon how that works, that will give us insight into the dynamics of a disparity study. Is that what you said? Because you broke up halfway through, and at least you did on my phone.
And I apologize for that, sir. I live in the country, so I'm working on that. But you are absolutely correct.
Okay. Well, that's kind of my understanding of where we were last time, and I mean, because a disparity study is going to take some time to get going, and if there are things that we can be doing in the interim, then I'd rather be doing that than just kind of sitting around waiting for something to happen.
Yeah,
I agree.
All right, I think we got the clarity on that we needed. Did y'all want to speak any more to that position, or I think we've got what we need to move forward to the next item here. So,
I mean, if nobody else has anything else they want to add, I'm happy to move on to the next item, which I think is mostly it.
Well, I meant the disparity item. So the disparity study. So in the going to step 3 here, one of the things y'all talked about last meeting was it seemed like y'all were all interested in disparity study, but the timing of it and when we would recommend it from the GOC was kind of where we didn't have time to kind of get through. So Crystal and I sent out
also the cost. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but also the cost.
Exactly. So Crystal and I did some research. She spoke to a community, and we got other information. And so, in general, on the cost side, and Crystal, chime in here. What we're probably expecting is somewhere in the $200,000 range.
Wow.
And so that's kind of thinking about our size and what other communities have paid. So that would be our best estimate, right? You don't know until you do an RFP. And then the timing, it's probably at least a year process. There's a lot of data work that the consultant would do. So what we did was we shared a number of places that have done it. We shared links on how they're using it. We shared Savannah's report that they give based on how it's going in Savannah as well. And so I think kind of the question on the table is, do you all want to recommend doing a disparity study? Are there any other questions you have about disparity studies for Crystal and I? And if so, if you do want to recommend it, what's the timing y'all are thinking about?
How long do these take? What's the timing for such a study to be conducted in a community of our size?
Crystal, you wanna take that one?
Happy to help, yes. So we have begun reaching out to communities, but so far we've had a conversation with Durham. We're wanting to touch base, I think, also with Hall County and Savannah. In the conversation with Durham, if I recall correctly, I believe it was a process that lasted over a year, as Josh noted. The cost was in a similar ballpark. It was and is a fairly extensive endeavor. And so it's not as if the consultant just sort of pops in and does all the things. There's a lot of collaboration that has to happen with staff. So it might be that the person in the MBE role may end up being sort of that key contact person so that the external consultant would be able to access the data that may be spread across ACC Gov. Those are some of the key facts that I can recall at this moment.
Did you say Hull or Hall County?
I think I said Hull, but I could have gotten it.
Hull?
Yes, I think I said Hull.
So not Gainesville.
So yeah, I'm looking up where Hull County is.
Well, I mean, my sense is we don't have $200,000 or ballpark at the moment. So, I mean, there are some things that we can do right now. When I say right now, I mean this fiscal year. And so, what I don't know that we necessarily need to make a decision right this second about, saying, yes, we want to do a disparity study, and the earliest we can fund it is a year from now. I'd like to get something done in the interim. And so, I don't know, do we have to make that decision basically right now in terms of whether we do or don't want to do a disparity study, or do we want to wait and kind of see what kinds of things this MBE position might be able to do?
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
I mean, I imagine it would take a while for the RFP process to determine who we'd even want to do that study, not to mention, deciding a framework for it before we even put out the RFP. So, I mean, it might be, close to a year before we'd even be ready to put that RFP out. So it possibly makes sense to go ahead and get the MBE person up and running and kind of put them to task to helping to develop that, collecting the data and develop that, and working on that RFP with management. So maybe 9 months from now we can get that RFP out and have the money ready to hand out come July of next year.
I mean, to me, that seems like a reasonable series of steps, because I don't know right this second whether, I mean, I certainly wouldn't know what are the appropriate questions to be asking right now, but hopefully somebody, whoever it goes into this MBE position would be in a better position to know what are the types of questions we need to look at and to ask to put into an RFP. So I think what you're suggesting, Melissa, in terms of process and timeline, makes sense.
This is Tim. I mean, I guess I might ask to disagree a little bit. I mean, I see the real need here that we're talking about is at least one of the big needs is a pretty great racial disparity when it comes to income in our community, and when it comes to access to wealth. And while I know that just having the MBE position in general, doing some of these things that can help everyone, I understand that there's benefits to that. But again, the benefits are not distributed equitably necessarily. And I really feel like the need here, and the need that's been here for, decades, if not forever, the existence of Athens, Georgia, is for us to address this racial, economic inequities that we have here, and also inequities that comes across from gender and such too. So my priority here is what the disparity study would bring us. I feel like that is priority number one. And with us recently passing this Black Lives Matter resolution that speaks to specifically doing things like this to help out minority-owned businesses, I mean, that was addressed directly in there. I really feel like our priority needs to be and doing this disparity study so that we can move ahead on that work.
I mean, I don't think anybody's arguing against doing it. I think what we're talking about is what is the appropriate, the set of logical steps that we need in order to make sure it's successful. So, I mean, my understanding of what the MBE person would do is that this would be part of their their mandate is to help, along with our inclusion office, to put some kind of proposal like this together, so that when we, this time next year, I guess not quite this time, a little bit before this time next year, when we're talking about budget stuff, that we would then be able to, budget for $200,000 or whatever it costs to do this study. So I don't think that we're talking about an either or. I think we're talking about how do we get to where we want to get to. What's the logical set of steps that we need to follow?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly takes some time to even, define what the framework of the RFP might be, and to draft the RFP. Those kind of things take several months typically, anyways. And we certainly, need that extra staff person there to do that. I mean, there's going to be some data collection and analysis of the situation on the ground before we even.
Well, isn't that what the disparity study would be, though, is collecting that data? We wouldn't have to be hiring our own positions to collect that.
I mean, in order to draft an RFP, you need some kind of picture of what these folks are going to study.
So to answer that question there, Commissioner Denson, so the position without the disparity study would begin collecting data moving forward, right? So the position would be able to focus in on data collection in the current state and into the future. The disparity study, as Crystal and I have dug into it, will help look backwards and assess the percent of minority and women-owned firms in the community, and then what percent of ACC Gov's contracts are going to those firms in the past, right? And then we can begin capturing that data more effectively moving forward as well. So the disparity study is looking backwards and assessing and analyzing what's in who's operating and who owns businesses in our community who could and may be getting those contracts or may not be. And then moving forward, the MBE position can help do that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess it does. And I mean, I agree also with it's not the either or, but from how this discussion is going, it seems like we're prioritizing the position first, and then saying that next year or sometime, then we'll start the process of possibly doing the disparity study. And I guess the disagreement I have with that process is that I guess going back to Commissioner Link's first comment when we started this off, is the chicken or the egg, and that the way I see it is I'd rather see the disparity study come first and us fund that, since we only have funding to do one or the other right now. I'd rather see that, get that fast track, because like you said, it's going to be a months-long process even once we get it started. So I'd rather see us start that process now than, say, have that process starting in a year and a half or so.
I don't think we have funding for one or the other. I don't think we have we don't have the $200,000 in this year's budget for the study, but we do have the position funded already. So if we were to, urge moving forward with the study, we'd have to do some kind of budget amendment and figure out where that money's going to come from. And also it would take several months to even pull the RFP together, I would think.
Mr. Chair, could I chime in with something?
Sure.
Just to address some of your concerns, Commissioner Denson, I just wanted to remind everyone, because I know our last discussion was very large, but Crystal had come forward with a lot of really great ideas for things we could do here locally that MP position, or that her office, or maybe in combination, could work on in terms of modifying like the language with purchasing to make it more friendly and accessible, and doing programming and educational like trainings that would help make it more accessible to minority-owned businesses here. So I do want to make it clear that when I said that we can't do anything that preferences a minority or a woman-owned business over another one, that doesn't mean we can't do things that are targeted to that population. Going out into certain communities, or having trainings on certain topics that we think will be especially relevant to those individuals. Just as long as we make those sorts of things accessible to everyone, we're still meeting our our obligation. But I think we can really make a difference, and Crystal can probably speak to that a little bit better than I can. But I think it also is important to know that when we're talking about doing a disparity study, and then in the hopes of justifying a race-based program in the future, it is always helpful for us from a legal perspective to have exhausted, and I shouldn't say it's helpful, it's required that we have used other race-neutral means before we jump to a race-based program. So using this MBE position and taking these other steps that are sort of like the low-hanging fruit will put us in a better legal position in the future.
Okay.
That makes sense.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Did Crystal, did you want to talk a little bit maybe about the process? If we were to try to start putting a RFP together right now before we have the MBE person in place, how that might work versus how it might work with an MBE person in place?
Particularly with regard to preparing the RFP?
Sorry, say that again.
Are you saying specifically with regard to preparing an RFP? Sorry, are you able to hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. So forgive me, I'm thinking and processing.
So Crystal, I'll let you know our purchasing administrator, Jessica, is on too, so she can help on the RFP side as well if she wants to jump in, or Toro want to jump in.
So I think I definitely would love, Jessica and Tori, your input. So my initial thoughts would be as follows. We would probably continue with the process that Josh and I have initiated. We've had a conversation with Durham. I've been able to grab those notes really quickly. So if we want to talk through some of those details, we can do that. Savannah, and it was Henry County. Please forgive me. I submitted that in the notes. Just talking to some additional jurisdictions who have gone through this process, both to learn what their experiences were like, what their timeline was like, what the average cost was, and just sort of to become a little bit more acclimated to what's actually involved in the mechanics of conducting a disparity study. Once we had some of that information, I would anticipate collaborating with finance to pull together an RFP, focusing on the priorities that you, our GOC, have indicated you would like us to prioritize. As far as the timeline for producing that document, the inclusion office currently has one full-time staff member. But if we're able to collaborate across multiple departments, I'm more than happy to be as creative as we need to be to get it done quickly.
Okay, super. Thank you.
This is Toro with purchasing. The prospect of spending the amount of money for an inclusion study that I personally, this is my personal believe, is not necessary, because everyone here knows what Athens is like, and Athens is a unique animal, and it must be treated as such. I was born and raised here, and we have to come up with unique situations because we're unique people. And we have a unique community. So we don't need a $200,000 study. We need people on the ground that the actual commissioners are aware of and can send to specific areas to shore up. It's not really complicated. The commissioners are elected by the people. The people need these things. Send those people to that place. An MBE coordinator would then take that authority granted by the commissioners and bring those vendors up to speed so that they can participate on an equal footing. If they win or lose is irrelevant. We want them just to be able to participate on an equal footing. No one gets an unfair advantage just because they're born a certain way, but everyone gets an equal opportunity. That is what purchasing tries every single day to do. That's my take.
Thanks, Tara. I mean, I think, for me, one of the important things is what Sherry said, which is if we're going to have a program, we need to make sure that it is legally defensible. And if Sherry is saying that from a legal requirement point of view, we have to show that we've done everything else first and that hasn't worked, then I think that's a really important thing that we need to do. And I'm thinking that what Tara just mentioned and what the MBE person would do in collaboration with the inclusion office would get us down, starting down that road. So, I don't think we can ignore the importance of the law and creating whatever process we want to create as we move forward, but creating one that is legally defensible. So in other words, if we do get sued, we win.
I like that guy.
Yeah. I agree. Like it needs to be legally defensible. And from what I understand, if we were to make a specific minority focused contracting policy, we'd have to offer some proof that we're not giving minorities appropriate opportunity for these contracts. And that requires a study to prove.
Ma'am, what have you called it? Equal opportunity?
Equal opportunity. I think what we decided is we do want something that's race-based. We realize the long-standing disparities, and we want to provide some equity.
But the equity is involved in equal opportunity. You got to have the same starting line.
So
go ahead.
Torres, Josh, I think that what we're hearing is that there is a desire to do both, and if you're going to change a policy, as Commissioner Link said, the disparity study is required. So if the GOC, if our commissioners want to change the policy, then the recommendation needs to recommend a disparity study. So I think so Tori, that's kind of what we're talking about here is the policy change. If the GOC is recommending a policy change, then it requires a disparity study.
Yes, but in the meantime, that there are things that we could be doing that perhaps we have done in the past, but are, because of budgetary issues, haven't been doing so much of recently.
And Sherry's, talk about the legally defensible. I agree with that. That's a good point. So, I can get behind that. I just want to make sure that, basically that we move forward with the RFP process as quickly as possible, as it makes sense for us to be able to. And so not necessarily waiting a full year from now or longer, something like that, but just, definitely assigning that to this new position to have that be one of the priorities so that we can get that off the ground and running. Because I see this, as we kind of discussed last meeting, this disparity study has implications beyond just purchasing. We talked about how this study could actually have an effect on multiple different ways about different programs and stuff that we could be doing here. So I just want to make sure that we're moving ahead on that as quickly as we can, but in a way that still makes sure that all of our actions are legally defensible.
And I would agree with that. I think everybody on this who's in part of the meeting at the moment is saying we want to do both. I think the question is, how do we do that? And I don't think we want to wait 5 years to do a disparity study, but I do think it will be more helpful and more successful in the long term if the person who ends up being in the MBE hire is tasked with helping to develop that RFP, along with cooperation from, other offices in the government. But if we're talking about the chicken and the egg, it makes sense to have the MBE person in place first rather than try to do an RFP and then wait for the MBE person to be hired.
I'm sorry, this is Jessica Berry. Can I jump in for just a second?
Sure.
So we're throwing out the term RFP, which obviously we're not opposed to. But I believe there may be some consortium contracts that have special consultants on them. Would you all be interested in purchasing, starting to research those contracts to see if that might be a way to go to contract quicker for a disparity study?
I mean, I think whatever you all could do to speed up the process would be welcome.
Okay.
I'm also interested in making sure that we get the best possible study. From consortiums, do you mean that we have like ongoing relationships with certain entities that do these kind of studies? Because I want to make sure that whoever does this study, they're going to be thorough and well experienced in this kind of work, rather than
sure
an entity that this is just something they may or may not regularly do.
No, sure. So we would definitely, any consortium that we look into, we would make sure that this was, we could always check references to see how they did on past projects for things, for actions related to a disparity study, or, we could potentially find a consortium contract that has multiple vendors on it and then write a request for qualifications where we could ask specific questions to the number of vendors that say that they have had involvement in one of these. It just kind of, you still have every right to vet the firm, so to speak, or the entity, but you could potentially shorten the process because the competitive nature of bidding has already been completed.
I mean, I'm personally interested in casting a wider net rather than a more narrow one.
Okay. Just throwing that out there as an option.
Considering we don't necessarily have the money in the budget, for this fiscal year to actually fund that study, I would rather we cast a wider net to make sure we get the most qualified entity to conduct it.
Absolutely. I was just trying to inform that there may be a quicker process if needed.
I mean, quicker isn't necessarily better. I would rather we have a truly thorough study. I mean, like Tim said, this isn't just about purchasing. There are multiple levels of inequity throughout the community. And if we can find an agency out there that is qualified to look into those multiple levels, I say all the better, because I have a feeling we need to have this conversation far beyond purchasing and contracting.
Sure.
All right, y'all. Is there anything else on this item?
I was just going to ask if we're coming to some kind of consensus or not. I mean, what I think we're talking, my understanding of where we're at, and people jump in if it's not expressing what you're thinking, is that obviously we have the MBE person programmed for the budget. We don't have the money programmed in the budget to do the study this year, at least without moving money around. Having the MBE person in place would give us two things. One is they could be going out into the community and helping people off the bat to become more involved in the process of bidding on contracts, but also that one of the first things that they would be required to do is to gather information, start to look at how other communities, what other communities have done in preparation to be working on an RFP that, we would probably submit sometime later in the budget year, this budget year, in anticipation of funding being made available to actually fund it next budget cycle. Is that where we're at, just to give Josh some clarification, or do people have a different understanding of where we're at?
That makes sense to me.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I guess just to solidify it a little bit more, would be, I guess I would ask that Josh take this and kind of bake it into our goals and objectives discussion and presentation coming up this winter, so that it is one of the items that we are discussing in our goals and objectives for next year's fiscal year.
Yes, let's make sure it's a budget priority.
Will do, and I'm starting that conversation September 11th, so we can even do that.
So do you have clear direction now, Josh, in terms of where the consensus seems to be in terms of where we're heading on this issue?
Sure do. I appreciate it, y'all.
Okay. Are we ready to move on to the second topic, which is and I think this would be a fairly brief one, is the question of the policy on naming of public places. And I did talk emailed rather with the mayor. Josh and I were in an email with him because it wasn't really clear to me or to Josh exactly what we were being tasked with. But I think what he wants us to look at is the process of how we go about doing this, because apparently it's not as clear as it might be. Is that your understanding as well, Josh?
Sure is. Yes, sir.
Okay. So, did you want to maybe talk a little bit about, talk about what you had wanted to talk about, I guess.
Yeah, real quick, I just want to thank finance staff for being on, and Crystal and Sherry for helping on that last item. We have two policies that we wanted to share, and so one is pretty recent to the GOC from 2017, and so our Leisure Services Director and our Planning Director are on the line to walk through these two policies. And so let's start with Kent. Kent, can you speak to the naming and renaming of public facilities, parks, natural areas, and amenities, and just give the GOC a background on how it came into being in 2017 and areas of opportunity you think as we meet in future meetings to discuss?
Sure, I'll be glad to. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for the chance to be here this evening. Just as Josh just indicated, this is as recent as 2017. And actually, in February 15th of 2017 is when Virginia Walker's son submitted a letter to Mayor Denson requesting the naming of Trail Creek Park after his mother. This is when Virginia Walker was still alive. On July 5th of 2017, Mayor Denson assigned this to GOC because at that time, our naming policy was very vague. It really consisted of about 2 or 3 sentences that just said a request must be submitted. It will be considered by the manager's office and forwarded to the mayor and commission, but gave no kind of guidelines or support information that was needed. So Mayor Denson submitted this to GOC for consideration. At that time, my staff, along with myself, did some extensive research on other policies around the country and brought some of those forward, as well as drafted an initial policy that was discussed amongst this committee and ultimately adopted in November of 2017. Then it was in the summer of 2018 that Virginia Walker passed, and then not much longer after that, we were able to get that name approved. So perhaps one of the things that we'll be considering in future meetings that has been one of our biggest obstacles has been defining that term community support. We have certain thresholds that people must meet with their request. I've had 2 more additional requests on my desk for a few months. And one of the questions that always comes up that's in the policy that they must prove that there's some community support for that name. And what does that mean? That can mean a letter with 10, 12, 25, 50 names on it. where do you stop and how much do you need? So we had to work through that. Former Commissioner Harry Sims was one of those that led the charge for the naming of Virginia Walker Park. And he and I had several discussions on what would satisfy the mayor and commission and the community as a whole on a broader support. So I think that's one thing we may want to discuss and define as we move forward. The other is then just what thresholds do we want to take? Initial drafts had public meetings that we may want to go forward for input from the public. Then it was decided that the mayor commission meetings to discuss these items were public, and that would be enough. So talking about thresholds and how we define or clarify these requests as they come in, I think is our topic of discussion going forward.
All right, thank you. That's much clearer to me, at least. I know Melissa probably remembers when we had some of this discussion last time, but I think it was before Tim and Patrick.
Yes, I do remember.
Yeah. So is there anything else that needs to be added? What I imagined is, for this meeting at least, it was just really to kind of kick us off in the process of discussing, kind of figuring out what the issue was. And that would be preparation for thinking over the next month or so about, how we might want to address the topic of quote unquote community support. Are there other things that need to be said at this moment in time?
Well, if y'all have any questions for Kent, we could ask him. I do want Brad to share the street renaming procedure, which is a little bit older, and that's kind of the second piece to this. But do you have any questions for Kent before we hand it off to Brad?
So basically, we just need to define what broad community support or some mechanism that would indicate that, correct?
That would certainly be helpful. And I think if we go back now, we've got some guiding principles that's in the policy, I think, that have been very useful. But the thresholds that we want to ask people to meet, including community support, may be where our focus is going forward.
I know Angel is on the line too from Central Services. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what Kent shared, Angel, from Central Services standpoint.
No, I mean, we thought that it was running okay. We didn't realize there was like the problem that Kent mentioned. So, but we're fine with making changes to address those.
All right, thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right. So just to summarize, or for clarification, from Kent's point of view, really the only thing that you're concerned about is that we don't really have a very clear definition of what community support means, and we need to come up with a clearer one to basically make the process itself clearer. That's basically your issue? Is that correct?
Well, that's one of those thresholds that I'm referring to, and two of the requests, for instance, that I have on my desk currently are former employees that worked for Leisure Services that now there's somebody on their behalf requesting that we name something for them for their community support, of which they got paid for many, many years to do. Is that something we're in agreement with or not? There's things like that that are part of the thresholds that we need to look at. Okay.
So, Kent, through Josh, I guess, could you maybe put together, maybe a one-page memo with whatever are the issues in the current policy that are causing you heartburn? Okay. And if you could get that to us for the next meeting, that would be helpful.
All right. I'll be glad to do it.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks,
Brad.
Okay.
Brad?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Then I think you can see this now. So unlike Kent's that was just a couple years old, it is not often that I bring things to you guys that outdate me as an employee here, but this one does by about 6 months. The current policy for street name changes was adopted by, at that point, the CEO and commission in January of '92, and it has never been amended. And I think this is the only directive. I've never done a real search in the ordinance to see if there's other language, but this is a policy that we've used for the last 28 years if we have a request for a street name change. In general, what it says is that it has to, an applicant or somebody that's wishing to change the name of a street has to come to you all first and make a written request to you at one of your regular meetings. Describe the street they want to change, why, new name, and then you all will make a formal vote as to whether or not to receive it for consideration or not. If you do receive it for consideration, it is then forwarded to the planning department, who prepares a report for the planning commission. We've got 60 days to get it back in front of you from the time you send it to us. We also send written notices to all property owners and residents of the affected street, and then prepare the report accordingly, and then ultimately it comes back to you for a vote. And upon approval, if it is ultimately approved, it even gives a list of who we're supposed to notify upon final approval. A couple things with this. This is the policy we followed in the past. There's nothing in here. Street name changes are a lot different than, I think, than the renaming of a facility or a building, because it affects everybody that lives there in terms of address changes and legal documents and bills and all of those things. And just for an example, and it's happened with the last couple that have come forward, and I think both of them were absolutely with the best of intentions, but there was a street. The one that is currently pending is a street that is being asked by a resident to have the name changed to honor an individual. But the resident that's bringing the street name change forward doesn't live on that street, so they're not affected at all by it. And that's generally what we get when we send these letters out: is who asked for it, do they live here, those types of things. So it's an old policy. It's what we've used for a long, long time, but just wanted to present it to you and see if you still feel like this is an appropriate policy to follow, or if you would like to see some additional criteria built into it, which is ultimately absolutely your call to make.
So, okay, thanks. So, does anybody have any questions for Brad?
Yeah, Mr. Griffin, I did a little bit of research of other cities. So it seemed like we just need to do I would say a complete overhaul. Just have some more, what's the word I need to, what I'm trying to say, but just have the process of people changing the street names to be more stringent, I guess, if that's the right word. Because like you said, there's some legal issues and stuff like that. But I look forward to hearing what my other colleagues say. But I think Charlotte has a good one when it comes to street names. And I looked at, I don't have my notes in front of me, but there's another city that has a good, good rules when it comes to street names. And I was wondering, have you done any research what other cities have done?
We have not done any research at this point. The last couple that you all have received have just been somebody bringing forth in more of an honorarium type of approach that they want to name the street after somebody. For years, when we would get these street name changes, it was typically products of old city and county streets that were very close to each other. And, so you've got residents that live on a street. I think we've got an Edgewood Drive in the former city and an Edgewood in the former county, and mail getting, mixed up. And so one of the streets comes in, the residents want the other street name to be changed. They don't want theirs to be changed. They want to make the other guy do it. And then you get the back and forth. And ultimately, you guys are in the crosshairs of that in terms of, first of all, making a recommendation to us as to whether or not you want us to pursue it. And then if so, it comes back to you for a formal vote. But we can certainly look at other cities, and this is 28 years old.
Yeah.
I think Patrick, if you have some information, if you would be willing to share that with the other members of the committee, that would be great. It seems to me I think what you're asking for, Brad, is just some clarification as to whether the policy is still working or whether we may need to tweak it a little bit. I mean, to me, it seems that there are two reasons that we might talk about, renaming streets. So one is to avoid confusion. I get confused. Every time you're in Atlanta, there's like 27 different Peachtree streets. So, if we're having issues of confusion, where we have two streets that are so closely named, and if anybody in planning or in the manager's office or wherever knows of some instances like that, I think it would be helpful for us to, for those to be brought forward to the GOC for our discussion, as we move forward. The second reason, to name streets, I think, is obviously the honorific. We want to honor somebody or an event or, something that happened on the street or whatever happens to be. That's, I think, is a slightly different category. It's not really so much trying to resolve confusion. It's, which has maybe a more practical, pragmatic point of view. It's wanting to honor someone. So certainly in terms of the first, if Brad, or anybody else, if you know of issues right now that are problematic with two streets that are very closely named, that is causing problems for, the mail or delivery or provision of, fire protection or anything like that, then I think that's something that, we could address fairly easily or fairly quickly. I do know, just having kind of followed some of these types of activities in other communities, I actually had one of my PhD students early on in my UGA career did his dissertation on issues around street naming. And there's a real difference between residential streets and commercial streets too. What he found was that many times on commercial streets, businesses they didn't want to have streets renamed because there were huge amounts of expenses involved in things like getting stationery reprinted with new addresses and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I do think that there are some economic and some kind of practical things that we as a committee also kind of need to think about as we start to contemplate any possible changes to this policy. But it is 28 years old, and it's probably time for a fresh set of eyes to take a look at it. Does anybody else have any questions?
I think that's why we're here today. We've got one on the table right now that came to you all several months ago now for Flint, for Odd Street, where somebody came forward and wanted to rename a portion of Odd Street in honor of a former resident, and we are sitting and holding on that one. I have contacted the lady that brought it forward and let her know that we haven't forgotten her, that the decision was made because we knew we wanted to talk about naming policy across the board, to revisit the policy, and then once we get a new one, we'll move forward with it.
Okay.
But, I can certainly bring you. There are some examples out there, some of which ultimately have come to you all, and I think there were decisions made years ago not to change anything. But there are still a few out there that we can certainly give you as examples of duplicates, that same name, street in two different places. The only way we're able to differentiate is different address ranges on them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I chime in real quick, Andy?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think also that it's important to get the folks who live on that street or have businesses on that street in on the conversation a little bit earlier. From what I can tell, they're not made aware of the petition to change till after the mayor and commission has made some kind of initial decision. And I think that maybe part of that initial presentation should be a survey of properties on that street or something. And that could possibly help fulfill that broad community support criteria that is, noted in our other naming policy.
And I would agree with that, Melissa. I mean, I think, if we're going to start talking about renaming streets, then I think the I mean, at a certain extent, it affects the whole community, but it affects the people that live on that street perhaps a little bit more. And I think the earlier we can get the people involved, on a particular street involved in the process, then I think the smoother the process will run.
Yes, I agree. With anything, the earlier people are involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Andy, can
Patrick or Tim? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So my first question was just to Brad. I mean, and this might just be from my own perspective, but from how I've witnessed this over the last few years, it doesn't seem like we have these that often. How often do we actually have this process actually kick off for a street name change?
Not very often. The last two have been brought forward as people wanting to name a street in honor of somebody. Prior to that, maybe once every 4 or 5 years, and because they become so contentious so quickly. And part of that, I agree with Commissioner Link. The way this old policy is set up, it kicks off with you directly from somebody wishing to make the request instead of it coming to us first and allowing us to do a mailing and then set it on your agenda for consideration after you've had an opportunity to hear from people. I mean, that would be a simple procedural change that would put that input up front, but they are few and far between right now.
Well, I can think of, I believe, 4 in just the 6.5 years that I've been on the commission, but 2 of those were in Columbia Brookside. They were former Paldo Street, so those folks, there wouldn't be same residences. So I could foresee us having this kind of opportunity with the North Athens project, where a lot of these could come forward in that project, where you have residential properties coming down and being rebuilt. That's not as contentious as properties where you have long-standing residents and businesses.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm just trying to, for this part, I'm just trying to nail down where the issue is. So it's not as much that we're being overwhelmed by requests. It's more of just that the way the process moves forward once we do get a request is not necessarily structured in a way that is very beneficial to us politically and also for the community. So, I think maybe looking at other communities, kind of like what Commissioner Davenport brought up, might be a good way there. And just adding into, we're kind of talking about the honorarium and then the practical matters of stuff. I mean, I have to imagine, although I don't know, but possibly one of the reasons that we're also discussing this is what we've seen happening around the country, which is kind of the opposite of the honorarium of having streets and building names possibly named after historical figures that have not aged well for multiple issues. And possibly having, getting up, being proactive in front of that and finding a way for us maybe to address that issue. I'll bring up, like Lumpkin Avenue. That is an individual that has some serious historical issues that I'm not sure if I'm as comfortable with us honoring him with such a prominent street there. And I've had some discussions with the manager's office around how some other communities have handled that. And there's been some communities that, because of all these issues of actually having to change the name in general, which causes all those issues of having to change addresses and work with everybody, of basically making more of the honorarium change, but using it where you keep the name still the same. So, you find, a Lumpkin in our history that has had better history put behind them, such as Catherine Lumpkin, who did a lot of work combating economic and racial disparities and stuff here in Georgia. So I would love for us to have at least part of this discussion touch on that, of looking at where we might have problematic naming of streets and buildings and figuring out a process that is not, that is an easy one for us to deal with those issues and kind of move forward.
So the issue of honoring and de-honoring.
Sure. We can list that as de-honoring. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions for Brad or Josh? If not, if we can all put our thinking caps on then for our next meeting around the topic of the policies with regards to street names, and then also that Brad brought up, and then also just other types of names that Kent brought up in terms of how do we express community support, community interest. So if everybody could put some thought towards that. Patrick, if you have information that you could send out, that would be great. And then in the interim, maybe either Josh or Brad, if there are some other communities that you know of that, I'm not a big believer in reinventing the wheel. So if there are other communities that you're aware of that have particularly good policies that we might, take a look at, that you could get to us, that would be great as well.
We can do it.
Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, if I could hear a motion to adjourn, I would appreciate it.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, Melissa's moving, Tim is seconding. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, anybody opposed? All right, if not, we're adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating. Sorry for the technical problems at the beginning, but these things happen. All right, take care, everybody. Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.